We would be honored if you would join us.
Greetings and welcome to another YouTube episode of Film Stories with me, Dan Cooper. This week we've got just a really quick film story for you, something I came across. It's certainly not new news, but I came across it in an episode of Fat Man Beyond, Kevin Smith and Mark Bernardin podcast, and just thought it was worthy of sharing. If you haven't heard this story before, it's circulated for a few years now, but this is the first time I'd come across it, or at least remembered it, and it concerns the really interesting mini phenomenon of directors reusing story beats in different projects. And this was regarding Spielberg. So the recent 4K re-release of Back to the Future meant that all kinds of new little bits and bobs about the film popped up, including some test screenings from Ben Stiller and John Cryer. And John Cryer talked a little bit on Twitter about remembering in the original script of Back to the Future, so as I said, you may have heard this already, it was very different to what we finally saw on screen. In fact, there was no DeLorean, for example. There was a time machine, of course, but it needed a secret ingredient to make its nuclear fission work, and that ingredient was Coca-Cola. And continuing this kind of like classic 50s Americana idea, there was also a sequence at the end of the film which would have featured Marty McFly, who's still in the key character, or the lead character in the film, coming across a deserted atomic test site. This a scene that you might recognise from a later Spielberg movie. It should be noted, of course, that Spielberg didn't direct Back to the Future. That was Robert Zemeckis, but he did executive produce it, and it was at Spielberg's behest that the fridge scene was removed, because he was afraid that children would try and replicate the scene and get themselves stuck in fridges. So Marty finds this atomic test site, and to get back to the future, but also avoid being destroyed in the nuclear reaction, he seals himself inside a lead-lined refrigerator. Yes, that scene, of course, because Spielberg ultimately ended up not using that idea about using an old-school lead-lined refrigerator to protect you from a nuclear blast. He didn't use it in Back to the Future in the end, of course. The whole thing was done very differently and beautifully, but he would come back to that idea years and years and years later, and he would use it in the rather ill-fated and it ended up being one of the most derided scenes in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. It just goes to show you that clearly that scene never left Spielberg. He couldn't fit it into his final vision for Back to the Future, but he found a way to repurpose it and use it ultimately in the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Of course, the scene didn't really receive the kind of reaction that I imagine he would have wanted. It became synonymous with a plot perhaps stretching the realms of reality, and almost kind of replaced the term in popular culture jumping the shark, and now Nuke the Fridge is shorthand for a story beat that is rather ridiculous. But nonetheless, I'm sure Spielberg's happy he got to use his moment. And it just got me to thinking of the instances we've heard of directors or producers insistently forcing a story beat into a film because they've got some kind of obsession with it. Of course, another one that springs to mind that Kevin Smith also has talked about in the past is the producer John Peters, who was determined when Smith was writing the 90s Superman screenplay, determined to get a giant robot spider into the film. He made a whole list of demands for that film that Smith had to adhere to when writing the screenplay. And of course that film never happened in that version, but Peters did eventually get his wish. He got his giant robot spider when he produced The Wild Wild West a few years later. So, I mean, there's a couple. The Back to the Future was was the example that I came across recently and thought was really interesting. An interesting example of a director waiting years and years and years to get a favourite story beat into a film, to find a way to rework it into a story. But of course, there's the John Peters example. If you come across any more or heard any more, please pop them in the comments below. I'd love to read them. So there is just a little mini film story this week. We'll be back next week with another quiz. Until then, if you want more film stories, of course, you can find our print magazine. available for purchase. This month we have Brian Blessed in a wonderful in-depth interview talking about Flash Gordon and all sorts of other projects that he's worked on in a veteran career. We've got Film Stories Junior, our young film magazine written by young people. Of course, if you want more film stories, there's also a website, filmstories.co.uk, which is updated every day with news stories and long features. There's Simon's Wonderful Podcast, which you can find at a podcast downloader of your choice. And we're also on Twitter at Film Stories Pod and on Facebook at Film Stories Online. That's all from me this week. I hope you enjoyed that little film story. I'll be back next week with a quiz. I'll see you then. Have a good week. Bye bye.